When detectives with the Omaha Police
the
Department
vehicle.
decided to dig deeper into the evidence they had collected so far, they quickly zeroed in on something that they realized could be promising.
Да.
Early in her first interview, Kimberly had mentioned that before she answered the door on December 23rd, she had peered out the window and noticed a white SUV parked on the driveway. This was almost certainly the vehicle that the gunman had been driving. Authorities canvassed the local area, looking for anyone who might have recorded surveillance footage near the Brinkman home around the time of the crime.
God.
They soon got lucky when they discovered that a neighbor just a little ways down the road had a security camera. When detectives reviewed the footage, they got more than they bargained for. Not only had the neighbor's security camera captured video of a white SUV similar to the one Kimberly described fleeing the scene just after the home invasion had taken place, it also recorded the vehicle before the crime. Hours earlier, an identical-looking white SUV had traveled down the road and slowly driven up to the Brinkman home. It looked like someone was scoping out the place. While the video was too grainy to make out the suspects or the license plate of the vehicle, authorities were able to obtain some important information from it.
Nu
The
este
footage showed
niciunde
that
unde
the
poți să
crime
dai,
had
du-te
taken
în
place
pula mea.
over 7 minutes, and it was clear enough that police were able to determine the SUV's make and model. It was a 2016 Dodge Durango. Omaha police put together a list of similar SUVs using the state motor vehicle database. At the same time, they held a press conference where they asked anyone who might have seen an SUV like this to please come forward. The appeal to the public was a massive success and generated a bunch of new leads. One of these would soon catch the attention of detectives. The tip came from a man who said that he had seen a suspicious white SUV parked at his apartment complex a few days after Michael Brinkman's murder. There were 2 men near the vehicle, and they were behaving unusually enough that he had written down their license plate number. Authorities entered the information into their database, and sure enough, it came back as a match to a 2016 Dodge Durango. There was a catch, though. The vehicle belonged to a rental car company. Detectives were initially worried that this might be another dead end, but they followed up with the company to see what they might know. A representative said that this particular SUV had been rented between December 13th and December 27th to one person, a woman named Carnell Watt. When police brought Carnell in for an interview, she agreed to answer questions. She admitted that she had rented a white Dodge Durango for 2 weeks in December, but said that she had loaned it out to a number of people during that time. One of those people included her on-again, off-again boyfriend, a man she identified only by the name of Lee.
You rented a vehicle about that same time that kind of matches the description of our suspect vehicle.
Never mind.
Do you know who you lent the vehicle to at that point in time?
I have had various people around me, like my sister, her dude, one of the dudes I used to mess with.
Who's that?
Lee.
Lee?
Mm-hmm.
As soon as Carnell was asked any specific questions about Michael Brinkman's murder, though, her willingness to talk took an abrupt turn. She said she didn't know anything and quickly ended the conversation.
Did anybody say anything suspicious to you that you possibly think this might have been the vehicle, or anybody, these people may have been involved in this homicide?
Yeah, nice trick, Saber.
Anything like that
Fooled me
at
to
all?
take a left.
I don't know nothing about nothing. Like,
Authorities thought Carnell's behavior was suspicious,
Dacă merge aici
but they
și
didn't
te
have
uiți
anything
aici,
solid to press
când
her
ești aici,
further.
îți dai seama că, bă,
Instead,
încolo trebuie să
they
mă duc
began looking for more
pentru asta.
surveillance footage, hoping they could find something that
Oh,
definitively
este
linked her
bun, este
rental
bun.
SUV to the murder.
Oh my god.
By this point, police had figured out that the food spilled all over the place at the crime scene was from a fast food chain called Raising Cane's. Now, as a Canadian, I've never been to Raising Cane's myself, but from what I've read, it seems the half-eaten piece of Texas toast left behind was a dead giveaway, as it's a popular side that's included with a lot of the restaurant's combos. Anyway, using this information, authorities reviewed surveillance footage from every Raising Cane's restaurant they could in Omaha, hoping that they could spot the white Dodge Durango. Unfortunately, they came up empty. things weren't looking great for police at this point. However, that would change when they received a major update from the crime lab. Strangely enough, it was about that half-eaten piece of Texas toast again. Turns out, it was covered in DNA. This had been submitted to CODIS and had returned a match. It was
Damn.
to a 29-year-old man named Leandre Jennings.
I really like how this guy
Leandre
explains
had a
crime
long
scenes. He's a really
criminal
cool guy.
history that included gun charges and robberies, so it definitely seemed possible that he could be involved in a crime like this. When detectives heard the 29-year-old's name, it also instantly rang a bell. They wondered if Leandre could be the on-again, off-again boyfriend that Carnell Watt had referred to as Lee. Detectives brought Carnell back in for a second interview and confronted her with this new information.
I have to do a spiral
Once
for this
again,
one.
she denied knowing anything about any kind of crime, though she did admit that she knew Leandre Jennings.
Do you know Leandre Jennings?
Yeah.
And what's your relationship with him?
We were on again, off again.
Despite denying anything related to the murder, Carnell was also able to provide authorities with one more helpful clue. It came when they asked her about Raising Cane's.
Have you ever heard of a restaurant called Raising Cane's?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, have you ever eaten there? Have you and Leandre ever gone there?
Plenty of times.
Yeah.
Plenty.
Which one do you usually go to?
I went to the one in Iowa. They a little fast over there.
This cleared up why investigators hadn't been able to find surveillance footage of the white Dodge Durango at any of the chain's locations in Omaha. With this, authorities started searching restaurants immediately across the state line in Council Bluffs, Iowa. It didn't take long for them to find what they were looking for. Sure enough, surveillance at a Raising Cane's in the city had captured the white SUV as it went through the drive-thru just hours before the murder. The man behind the wheel appeared to be Leandre Jennings. With this, police were able to obtain Leandre's cell phone records, which provided more incriminating evidence. The 29-year-old's phone placed him within a block of the Brinkman home right before and after the crime. The records also revealed that this area was one that Leandre almost never traveled to. The final nail in the coffin, so to speak, came in the form of even more biological evidence. In addition to the toast, Leandre's DNA was found on the shower curtain rod in Michael and Kimberly's bedroom. Detectives concluded this was likely from when Seth had hit him in the head. Leandre was arrested on February 17, 2017, just under 2 months after Michael Brinkman's death. He was charged with first-degree murder. While this was undeniably a massive breakthrough, frustratingly, it was also where the investigation hit another wall. You see, though the case against Leandre Jennings was strong, police were never able to find any kind of link between him and Michael Brinkman or anyone else in the Brinkman family. At the same time, Leandre steadfastly refused to speak with detectives in any capacity, maintaining that despite the overwhelming evidence, he was innocent. As a result, authorities felt they had no choice but to go to trial anyway, without identifying the second suspect, or even figuring out the true motive behind the crime. By the time the proceedings began, in September of 2018, however, the prosecutors did their best to present a logical theory of the case. They argued that on the evening of December 23rd, Leandre and his unknown accomplice had likely gone over to the Brinkman house, expecting them to be easy targets for a robbery. Instead, the family fought back. When they did, Leandre panicked, killing Michael and fleeing empty-handed. In addition to the evidence, Kimberly and Seth took the stand to offer harrowing testimony. The prosecutor referred to their experience as, quote, 7 minutes of terror and devastation. Leandre Jennings and his defense team, meanwhile, argued that authorities had failed to consider other suspects. They tried to discredit Kimberly's testimony in particular, pointing out that even she had originally believed that someone else had been responsible. Ultimately, the jury agreed with the prosecution, and Leandre was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison, plus 70 to 85 years for 2 other weapons charges. At the time of this recording, he is incarcerated at the Nebraska State Penitentiary. Unfortunately, as it stands, it appears that the murder of Michael Brinkman remains frustratingly half-solved. Officially, there's not much to say about this. However, there were a couple of little loose ends we felt were still probably worth tying up, so we decided to add this little bit at the end to round out the video. Keep in mind, pretty much everything I'm going to say from this point on is pure speculation on our part, so feel free to disregard it or just stop watching altogether. Still here? Okay then. The first thing that's probably on most people's minds right now is motive. Was Michael Brinkman targeted? And if so, why? So, as far as this goes, I should say that there's one detail that I left out from the main story. That's the fact that Kimberly and Seth may have seen the two gunmen in possession of a banker's bag that belonged to Michael during the home invasion. We didn't include this, mostly because I didn't know where to fit this in, but also because it was only mentioned by a single source we came across. So I'm not really sure how much weight to give it.
Playtime over, hai
If
acasă.
true, this could be the thing that Kimberly and Seth heard the attackers refer to when they said that
Wooden
they
planks,
got what
unde e
they
pula
came for.
mea găsesc wooden
Now,
planks, bro.
as to what was in the
Căutați
bag,
disperare.
I have no idea. One would
Wooden
assume that it would
fucking
have to be
planks.
something valuable,
Mystery cargo.
though again,
Cam pe
we
bine,
don't
unde
actually
dracu e
know
wooden
that it
planks?
exists. Personally,
Container warehouse.
I'm skeptical.
Garbage. Oh my god.
Then there's the
Din asta,
matter
știi
of
cât
the
am din
identity
asta?
of the
Haide,
second
capul meu
gunman.
este pe nas. Atâta
There's not a
garbage.
whole lot to say here, though
Heavy
interestingly,
trailer makes light
one
work
news
on,
article from the time
light,
claims that police
wooden planks.
knew who this person
medium,
was,
no high,
but
no
didn't
low.
have any physical
Wooden
evidence
fucking
placing
planks.
him at the scene.
Avem aici.
If you want my personal opinion,
I don't.
I actually agree with the prosecution and
Good
think
for
that
you.
the most likely scenario was that Michael Brinkman's murder
Dacă mă arunc
was
în
a
cap de aici,
random
mă
robbery
bag în
gone
garaj.
wrong. I think when the SUV was captured on the surveillance
Like a
system
pale
the first
eye.
time, Leandre and his accomplice were casing houses to
way.
rob, and for whatever reason,
No way.
they settled on the
Sender să
Brinkman
facem
residence. I know that with cases like this, there's a tendency to think that
Dar
there's
trebuie
more
să
going
fie o
on,
manevră.
and that there has to be a more compelling explanation. And look, I'm willing to admit that I could be totally wrong here, but at the same time, random tragedies like this do happen. The other thing I'll say is that if you're thinking to yourself that this doesn't make sense and there has to be a more well thought out motive here, keep in mind, Leandre Jennings brought half-eaten food with his DNA all over it to a violent robbery. So I think on some level, we just have to admit to ourselves that he might not have been approaching this situation the same way we would have. Regardless of the
Întrebarea
explanation,
este
I
dacă
do
ține
sincerely
pomul
hope that this
ăsta. Dacă
mystery is
ține
solved.
pomul ăsta, e ok.
In an interview we
Îi dai
came
drogul.
across, Michael's loved
Hai să
ones
vedem.
spoke about how hard it was to be forced to move on without answers, and how the loss and uncertainty has left a hole in their lives.
Ce bine că am luat pe ăsta.
Nothing can ever bring Michael Brinkman back, but there is still a hope of giving him and his family the justice and closure that they deserve. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video.
Ăsta n-are cum.
Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all
Poți să te
notifications
tragi.
to stay
Că
up
nu
to
e
date
așa,
with
că
our
nu e mai greu
latest
pomul
releases.
decât camionul ăsta,
If
bă.
you're looking for
Dă-le
additional
morți,
ways
mă,
to
de
help
pom.
support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our
Dacă
Crimes of the
ne-ajunge
Week
Winci până
and
acolo,
Crimes
ok.
of the Week international videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub,
Dead.
share, and comment that you send
Oricum
our
îți trebuie
way.
wooden planks și aici
Once
nu
again,
este.
thanks so much, everyone, and take care.
Nu mă aștepta să se rupă. Se rupe dacă îi trece prin prea multe textură. Storage, wooden planks, no.
In the early
No.
morning hours of December 6th,
No.
2014, a man named
No.
Rob Leaf was too excited to sleep,
Consumables, no, what the
while
fuck.
almost everyone else in his
Factory,
Austin,
metal
Texas
beams,
neighborhood
trailer
had
store,
called
I
it a
don't care,
night.
container,
He was busy walking the quiet
garbage
residential
am
streets,
suficient,
geeking out over
și
a
în
cool
casă
new
și pe
piece of
afară,
tech he had
vehicle,
recently purchased.
service
The
support,
device in question was a
service
scope for one of his
Și nu este,
rifles,
bă.
which was
Încă o
equipped
asta ori aici,
with a
care-
thermal
ce poți să
imaging
review
camera.
are, mare
The
blăză.
camera was designed to detect heat radiation given off by living
sake.
things, and essentially allowed Rob to see in the dark. This is why he was out despite the late hour.
We have to go
He was
another way.
hoping to get some footage of deer. And, since his neighborhood backed
homosexual, nu?
onto a sizable plot
Am
of
mers în harta
woodland,
greșită, obviously.
this seemed like the perfect time and place for a test. It turned out that Rob's instincts couldn't have been more correct, though not in the way that he initially anticipated. You see, while shuffling through the settings of his camera that morning, he inadvertently recorded something a whole lot more interesting than the local wildlife. Before we get to today's story,
We have to
if
hide
you
it.
find our content interesting and informative and haven't already, we'd be honored if you take a second to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this. It really
Like
helps
and
us to
subscribe to
continue
Crime
building the
Zone.
channel.
Subscribe the first
And if
day.
you've watched a few of our videos
first
already,
clip,
you might not
actually.
even realize that you're not subscribed. While you're there, don't forget to
Da,
hit the
îți dă down
notification
subscribe,
bell.
nu știu de ce.
It helps
Am
you
avut
to keep up
câteva
to date with our
canale
latest
care n-au fost
releases
subscribe,
and helps
cu
us to
Hero
keep
Hey
up with
și
that
toate
pesky,
de astea.
ever-changing YouTube
Și
algorithm.
mi-am fost, n-am subscribe,
With
zic,
that
ce
out of
dracu,
the
să
way,
nu mai scot un
let's
clip.
get to the video.
E și funny și informativ, așa. Nu mă interesează, dar e funny cum discută. Mă interesează de gaming.
To anyone that
Văd
knew
că
her, it was clear that Kathy Blair
ce
believed in the
popular
power of
dance,
music,
francize
not
care
only as a means of
discut cu ele.
self-expression, but as a way to unite people, to create community, and to bring more beauty into the world. Born in Burbank,
Astea sunt făcute din
California in
oțel.
1961, Kathy's
Face mai
love for
mult
music
damage
began at
semnul ăla
an
decât
early
pomul.
age. As a child, she was always singing, and it soon became clear to those around her that she had a talent that more than rivaled her passion. After finishing high school, Kathy
era radio din
continued
mașină.
to nurture her gift. She moved to Austin, Texas, quickly falling in love with the city and its flourishing music scene, and ended up attending the University of Texas, where she earned a master's in vocal performance. While many people with Kathy's talents might have tried to chase fame and fortune in the music industry, after finishing school, she found a different way to share her passion with the world: teaching. In the meantime, she got married and had 2 children, Hannah and Joe. While she was unlucky in love and ended up getting divorced twice, her children were always the center of her world. In 1995, Kathy seemed to find her true artistic calling when she took over as choir director with the Christian Choral Society of Austin. She worked primarily with homeschooled students, teaching as many as 350 per year who ranged in age from 4 all the way up to their late teens. Over the next 2 decades, Kathy would go on to touch the lives of countless young people through the Choral Society. Many would go on to successfully audition for the all-state choir, while some would even pursue professional music careers. Speaking about her later in an interview, one such former student described her choice to become a musician, saying that it was Kathy's passion and belief in her that made her feel like it was possible. As is the case with so many extraordinary teachers, though, Kathy's impact went beyond just the thing that she was there to teach. To her students, she became a role model, a mentor, and a second mother. She took an interest in their lives and spared no amount of time or money when it came to giving them the best experiences possible. For example, many would later fondly remember building and designing stage sets for the various musical productions that the Choral Society would put on. When they did, Kathy always volunteered to turn her house into their makeshift workshop. It was impossible not to notice the lively atmosphere and community that she created amongst those around her. One of her friends jokingly referred to it as the Kathy Nation. While Kathy seemed destined to continue teaching and inspiring students for countless years to come, little did anyone know that she would never get that chance. Sadly, things were about to come to a terrifying and heartbreaking end.
Oh, it's my truck. Mister, you need to get out of the way.
Just before 12:15 p.m. on December 6, 2014, dispatchers with the Austin Police Department received a disturbing 911 call. It came from an address on the 4600 block of Tamarack Trail, located in the city's suburban northern outskirts. The call was from Kathy's son Joe, who had just gotten home,
Shit.
only to make a horrifying discovery.
He found mom dead. She was out of blood. On the road here. They killed my mom.
Joe, what's your mom's name?
Her name is Kathy Blair.
When officers arrived at the residence, they were greeted by a chilling scene in the master bedroom. There was blood everywhere, and Kathy's body was lying next to her bed on the floor. An autopsy would soon reveal that the 53-year-old had died from a combination of stab wounds to her chest and neck, as well as asphyxiation. Defensive wounds on her hands made it apparent that she had fought for her life. Not far from Kathy's bed was a large jewelry box, all of the drawers from which had been removed and thrown onto the floor. At first, the stolen jewelry seemed to suggest that burglary had been the motive behind the crime. However, when investigators took a closer look, they weren't quite sure. Nothing in the rest of the house had been touched, including other valuables that were in plain sight, such as Kathy's laptop, phone, and television. Not only that, but there was blood on the jewelry box and in several other areas of the bedroom, suggesting that it hadn't been ransacked until after Kathy was killed. Finally, it appeared that the killer had entered through the back door, which Kathy kept unlocked. Taking all these details together, detectives began to piece together a theory. They speculated that Kathy had been the victim of a targeted killing. This person had known the easiest way to get into her house and had attacked her while she was sleeping. The rest of the scene had simply been staged to look like a burglary in an attempt to cover their tracks. Unfortunately, it soon became clear to authorities that finding this person wasn't going to be easy. Aside from a bloody shoe print that had been left in the bedroom, there was no physical evidence recovered at the scene. However, if their theory was correct and the attack was targeted, it meant that someone out there had a motive for killing Kathy Blair. Investigators weren't sure what it was, but they knew there was only one way to find out. After analyzing the disturbing crime scene, detectives with the Austin Police Department began their investigation into Kathy Blair's murder by interviewing those close to her to see if they could uncover a motive. Naturally, they started with her son Joe, who had been the one to discover Kathy's body. Joe explained that at the time of the killing, he had been staying with his mother while awaiting assignment in the Navy. On the night of December 5th, he had gone to a party with some friends and had ended up crashing overnight there with a few people. He hadn't come home until around noon the following day, which was when he made the horrifying discovery and called 911. Police looked into Joe's alibi, and everything added up, and he was quickly eliminated as a suspect. While speaking to Kathy's friends, police learned that the 53-year-old had spent her entire day leading up to her death helping her choir students prepare for a performance at Pioneer Farms, a living history museum and tourist attraction in the city. After the performance, she had told several people that she was looking forward to going home and having a relaxing weekend. This helped to reinforce the timeline of the case. Kathy had been killed sometime between getting home on the night of December 5th and the morning of December 6th. As for who could have had a motive for wanting Kathy dead, no one seemed certain, though one possible person of interest was brought to the attention of investigators several times: Kathy's second husband. Those closest to Kathy said that even though they had already been divorced for 4 years, things were still extremely bitter between her and her ex. Moreover, it appeared that Kathy feared for her safety. When she had moved into the house she was renting on Tamarack Trail several months back, she had specifically asked her friends and her landlord not to reveal that she was living there, and had even outright said to a few people that she wanted the new residence to be a place her ex would never find. Understandably concerned by this information, police paid a visit to Kathy's former husband at his residence just outside the Austin city limits. Almost immediately, he set off red flags for detectives, when upon being informed of his ex-wife's death, instead of asking what had happened, he asked, "Was she shot?" As bizarre as this was, though, the man offered an alibi for his whereabouts on the night of Kathy's murder, saying that he had been camping at an RV park. He also agreed to let officers conduct a search of his house, where nothing incriminating or unusual was found. Police were still suspicious, but with nothing actually connecting the ex-husband to the case, they decided to move on for the time being and pursue other leads. One of these leads came from a friend of Kathy's who called detectives roughly a week into the investigation about another potential person of interest. The friend explained that they and some others had thrown an impromptu memorial for Kathy at a local business, during which, out of nowhere, a man that no one seemed to recognize got up and started talking about her. The man had an unsettling demeanor, and what was stranger, from the way he was speaking, it appeared that he didn't even really know Kathy. Unfortunately, the friend couldn't provide any more information about the man, but luckily for investigators, the situation was bizarre enough that it had made an impression on a number of those in attendance that day. After questioning several of them for details, one person was able to remember where they had seen this man before. He was a clerk at a local women's clothing store. Detectives questioned the man, who admitted that he did not, in fact, know Kathy Blair. He said that he had heard about her story on the news, and it made him sad, so he decided to go to a memorial and try to celebrate her life. This was certainly unusual, but the man denied having anything to do with the crime, and without any other kind of evidence, authorities had once again hit a wall. As luck would have it, though, they were about to receive another tip, and this one would completely change the course of the investigation. Several days into the Kathy Blair investigation, detectives with the Austin Police Department were busy chasing down any leads they could find when they received a call out of the blue from a man named Rob Leaf. He said that he had something that he wanted to show them, something that he thought might be of interest to the case. It was some video footage he had recently taken while testing a new scope that he had purchased for one of his rifles, which was equipped with a thermal imaging camera. When Rob met with detectives, he explained that on the morning of December 6th, he had been out walking around his neighborhood in North Austin trying to get footage of deer with the scope when he had witnessed something strange. At around 1:15 a.m., he noticed the bright beams of some headlights behind him and turned to see a car driving slowly down the road. It eventually came to a stop, though this stuck out to Rob as well. It wasn't in an area where anyone who actually lived there would have normally parked. After stopping, a man got out of the car and began walking down the street. He had turned onto Tamarack Trail before heading out of view. At first, Rob hadn't thought much of the unusual early morning encounter. The next day, he flew to Las Vegas for a trip he had planned with friends, so the whole thing kind of quickly left his mind. It wasn't until a couple of days later, when he read about Kathy's murder in the news and saw her address, that he started to realize that what he had seen might have been important. He had gone back to check the footage he had taken. Sure enough, he had captured video of both the car and the mysterious man. The footage itself was grainy and shaky, as Rob had been testing his scope at the time and was flipping through various settings. Also, since it was a thermal camera, the images it had captured were more like silhouettes, as the device was designed to pick up heat signatures. Still, as authorities reviewed the video dozens and dozens of times, there was enough detail to pick out a couple of important things. The man who was captured walking towards Kathy's house was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a unique sort of stride. Detectives were also fairly certain they could at least rule out certain vehicles using identifying features of the unknown man's car in the footage. This proved to be true when neither the vehicle owned by Kathy's second husband or the strange man at her memorial remotely matched what had been captured in the video. It was progress, but unfortunately it now meant the detectives effectively had zero suspects. Not only that, but things were about to get a whole lot more terrifying. On December 15th, 2014, just over a week after Kathy Blair's murder, Austin police were called to the scene of another chilling crime. They were alerted by a home care nurse named Dow Catrola, who explained that she had arrived at the residence of two of her patients that day, elderly couple Sydney and Billy Shelton, only to encounter a terrifying situation. Upon approaching the front door, Dow noticed that it was ajar. It hadn't simply been left open, though. Splinter marks in the wood suggested something far more ominous. It had been deliberately broken. After receiving no answer to repeated knocks and attempts to call inside, Dow hesitantly entered and walked towards Sydney and Billy's bedroom. What she saw disturbed her to her core. The couple was dead, and there was no question that they had been the victims of a terrifying attack. Upon arriving at the scene, Austin police confirmed the details of the horrifying discovery. Sydney and Billy had been viciously beaten and stabbed to death in their bed. At first glance, the disturbing crime didn't seem to make much sense. Sydney and Billy were the last people anyone would have expected to meet such a brutal end. They were in their 80s, had no enemies to speak of, and had been happily married for 64 years.
My God.
They lived modestly, had never been
64
wealthy,
fucking years.
and were loved by their family, friends, and neighbors. However, as detectives walked around the bedroom, they soon spotted something that made their blood run cold. Just like with Kathy Blair, a jewelry box in Sydney and Billy's bedroom had been ransacked, its drawers completely removed and thrown on the floor. It was like they were looking at the same crime scene all over again. Likewise, the other similarities between the two cases were too much to overlook. Both attacks had taken place in the victims' bedrooms. A knife had been the primary murder weapon, and blood evidence revealed that the victims' jewelry had been stolen after they had been killed. The crimes had also taken place in the same general area. The Sheltons lived just a 15-minute drive south of Kathy, in Austin's Brentwood neighborhood. Though convinced that the murders had been committed by the same perpetrator, try as they might, police struggled to find any sort of connection between the victims. Kathy and the Sheltons hadn't known each other, and there wasn't any obvious social link between them either. They attended separate churches, had separate friend groups, and as far as police were aware, hadn't even so much as shopped at the same grocery store. However, with a possible serial killer now on the loose, authorities knew it was likely only a matter of time before their culprit struck again. Fortunately, just when it seemed like the stakes couldn't get any higher, they got a tip that would begin to tie the whole case together. After connecting the murders of Kathy Blair and Sydney and Billy Shelton, Austin police were desperate to find something concrete that linked the victims, believing that this would be key to unmasking the killer. Worried that the suspect would strike again if they didn't act quickly, they began expanding the pool of people they were interviewing, hoping that if they cast a wide enough net, they would find what they were looking for. The tactic paid off when detectives got in touch with Kathy's friends, who shared a piece of information that they hadn't come across up until now. The friend said that a few months ago, Kathy had mentioned an uncomfortable interaction she'd had with a handyman who had been hired by her landlord to do some work at the rental property where she was living. Kathy had complained about the quality of the work the man had done and had also described him to the friend as creepy. Investigators spoke to Kathy's landlord, who said that they remembered the incident. The handyman's name was Timothy Parlin. As authorities would soon discover, Tim's brother was a deacon at a local church, the same church that Billy and Sydney Shelton attended. That wasn't all that detectives learned about Tim, though. While the 49-year-old now did a variety of odd jobs, this wasn't always the way that he had made a living. For most of his adult life, Tim Parlin had been a thief, one who specialized in stealing jewelry. Fortunately for investigators, Tim wasn't difficult to locate. He was out on parole after serving a lengthy prison sentence for multiple burglaries and was living out of a local extended stay hotel. When detectives traveled to the hotel, they found Tim, who agreed to speak with them, though in the parking lot, not his room. He didn't seem nervous, and when asked, initially said that he didn't even remember his supposed run-in with Kathy Blair. He eventually changed his mind once police began providing more details, but claimed the situation had been blown out of proportion. Besides, he said, on the morning of the murder, he had been working an overnight shift at a local 7-Eleven. Though authorities were certainly suspicious, they didn't have any information that could dispute Tim's version of events. That wasn't their only problem either. Neither Tim nor his vehicle were a match to the thermal imaging footage that Rob Leaf had provided. He drove a van, not a car, and unlike the man in the video who was tall, Tim was short and stocky. With that, detectives let Tim go on his way. No sooner had investigators done this, though, Then they discovered that the 49-year-old's alibi was a complete fabrication. When they called his manager at the convenience store, they learned that Tim had been fired at least a week before Kathy Blair was murdered. Upon racing back to the hotel, authorities found that Tim was no longer there. This turned out to be a stroke of luck, though, as instead, they were greeted by his wife, who did allow officers to perform a search of their room. The search revealed a key piece of evidence, a slip from a local pawn shop.
Yeah,
It showed that Tim had pawned a piece of jewelry on the exact same day Kathy's body was discovered. Sure enough, when detectives followed up with the pawn shop, they were able to confirm that the specific item Tim had pawned was a pendant that belonged to Kathy Blair. Surveillance footage obtained from the business shed light on another part of the mystery. At the time Tim traveled to the pawn shop, he had been driving a dark green Toyota sedan. It belonged to his sister and bore a striking similarity to the vehicle in Rob Leaf's video footage. The resemblance was enough for police to obtain a warrant to impound the Toyota. A search of the car uncovered the most crucial piece of evidence yet: blood on the front passenger seat and floor. Testing proved that it belonged to Kathy Blair. Following these discoveries, detectives brought Tim Parlin in for questioning. Confronted with the evidence, though, he still denied everything and began to repeat the same bizarre phrase over and over again. Quote, "These hands didn't kill anyone." The interview grew more and more heated, until after several hours, Tim finally cracked. He said that he would tell investigators who really did it, then stated that they needed to speak to a man named Sean Gant Benalcazar. When detectives first heard the name Sean Gant Benalcazar, they were more frustrated than intrigued. They knew that they had Tim Parlin in a tough spot, and they figured that he had simply spit out the name of a random person, knowing that police would have to investigate what he said before continuing with their case against him. A closer look into Sean's background seemed to confirm this suspicion. He was a 30-year-old former high school science teacher with a degree in microbiology who had never been in trouble with the law. He also lived more than 200 miles away in the city of Galveston. Still, for the sake of thoroughness, detectives arranged to meet with Sean at a police station close to his home. The interview started off smoothly, with the 30-year-old saying that he had no idea what was going on. Still, he said he would help out in whatever way he could, explaining that he had only met Tim Parlin a few months ago, but even in that brief time, he could see that he was dangerous.
We're investigating a murder in Austin, and in particular we're looking at Tim Parlin as the person that we believe committed the murder.
I'm completely in the dark on this. Who was murdered?
The thing is, honestly, I want to help you guys out because this guy wore in sheep's clothing, basically. Well, didn't tell me anything about his past. And I'm starting to feel like he set me up like a patsy or something.
As casually as the interview had started, things soon began to head in a more disturbing direction when they asked Sean routine questions concerning his whereabouts on the nights of the murders. To the surprise of investigators, the 30-year-old not only admitted that he had been in Austin during the weeks that both crimes had taken place, he said that while in town, he had been staying with Tim Parlin. Over the next several hours, Sean's statements increasingly went off the rails as he gave multiple conflicting accounts of his actions on the night of Kathy Blair's murder. He began by saying that Tim had disappeared on his own for a good chunk of the night, before eventually saying that he had been with him in the car when they went to Kathy's house.
Oh, that's a bad outcome, bro. You should never say that. Stupid criminal.
Came out of the sack.
Da, de fapt am fost cu el. Da, nu mai, gata, nu mai cred nimic ce spui. Gata, te-ai mâncat. Te-ai mâncat de mine. Nimic de ce mai spui în momentul ăla e fail. That's not a good sign.
While it's safe to say that investigators were already stunned by how this interview had unfolded, things were about to take another turn when Sean asked to use the restroom. It was when he got up and began walking down the hall that one of the detectives noticed it. that same distinctive walk they had seen in Rob Leaf's video footage.
Oh,
It was Sean, not Tim, who had gone into Kathy Blair's house. This was confirmed when the interview resumed and police began asking the 30-year-old far more direct questions about the murder.
He bullied you into going to the house, or? I was scared, and he was taking a threatening tone. He told me to go in the house and get the stuff.
from not knowing anything about it to explaining why you were there. Oh
Yeah,
my
it was
god.
open.
Okay.
I looked around and kind of prowled and snuck through quietly. I turned on a couple lights in rooms where I didn't see her. And I found the room where she was, and she was fast asleep. That was the room her jewelry box was in. And so I opened the jewelry box, took the stuff out, put it in the thing. Maybe he went back? I don't know. But I didn't kill her.
While Sean was still trying to avoid responsibility for the actual murder, detectives were confident that based on his statements, he had to have been the killer. This is because he had already admitted to touching things in the room, things like Kathy's jewelry box, that had blood on them. It showed that she had already been dead at the time the things were stolen. When confronted with this information, Sean finally confessed to Kathy's murder.
She woke up, she lunged at me, grabbed the knife, started trying to wrestle it out of my hand. And then it was a struggle, and I
You piece of shit.
stabbed her in the neck.
If investigators had any shadow of a doubt as to Sean's guilt, this
Questa
went
se
away
l'emissione
too when they
ora
discovered that he was wearing the
praticamente
same shoes during the interview that he had during Kathy's murder. Impressions were taken that matched the bloody footprint left at the crime scene. Making matters even more chilling, when pressed for a motive behind the killing, Sean had little to offer. He revealed that Tim had been the one who kept the jewelry, and that he hadn't gotten any of the money from its sale. This was the last piece of information that the 30-year-old would provide, though. As soon as detectives tried to ask him about the murders of Billy and Sidney Shelton, he asked for a lawyer and ended the interview. Perhaps unsurprisingly, when Tim Parlin and Sean Gampin Alcazar were arrested, both men pointed the finger at the other. Tim ended up admitting that he had driven Sean to the scenes of both crimes, though said that he had nothing to do with the killings. Unfortunately for him, this didn't actually matter, as in Texas, if you take part in a crime, you can also be charged with that same crime. Given the evidence against him and the fact that he was the only one with connections to all of the victims, he was charged and ultimately convicted of capital murder in all three killings.
Piece of shit.
The case against Sean proved more challenging, since there was no physical evidence tying him to the murders of the Sheltons. He was never charged with their killings. By the time he went to court for Kathy Blair's murder, Sean had not only recanted his confession, he had accused police of coercing it out of him. He claimed that detectives had threatened him when he stopped the interview to go to the bathroom, and that they told him they weren't going to let him leave until he said he was guilty. The tactic appears to have worked. At his first trial, there was one holdout on the jury, and the proceedings ended in a mistrial. However, when Sean was tried a second time a few months later, the prosecution was better prepared, and he was found guilty of capital murder. Testimony from Rob Leaf and the video footage he took was apparently crucial to securing that conviction. At the time of this recording, both Tim Parlin and Sean Gampin Alcazar were serving life sentences without the possibility of parole.
Asshole. Get fucked.
I'm honestly not sure what bothers me more about this case.
Everything.
The complete and utter senselessness of it all, or just how close it appears things came to justice not being served. On the first point, it doesn't really seem like there was ever a real answer given as to why these murders were committed. Part of that is undoubtedly because Tim and Sean continue to deny responsibility for the crimes, though even beyond that it seems like these were just really senseless killings. The closest Tim ever appears to have come to offering an explanation was implying that a personal grudge had motivated him, at least in Kathy's case. According to reports, he said in an interview with police that he targeted her because he felt he, quote, didn't get a fair shake, after she complained about the work he did at her house. As far as we know, he has never commented about what he may or may not have had against the Sheltons, though it wouldn't surprise me if it was something equally petty. As for Sean, we can only speculate, though no matter which way you slice it, things look a lot darker. At least in Tim's case, you could argue that he wanted the jewelry that the victims had. But with Sean, he basically admitted that material gain wasn't a factor. Barring any new information, therefore, it seems that the only real explanation left on the table is that he murdered 3 people just for the hell of it, which is truly horrifying. Taking all of that into account, let's move on to point 2. Originally, I thought it was really cool that detectives managed to catch Kathy, Sydney, and Billy's killers in part using the footage from the thermal imaging camera.
Yeah, it is.
However, the more I thought about it, particularly the way that it ended up being crucial evidence at Sean's second trial, the more it sort of unnerved me. And look, it's still really cool from an investigative standpoint. I'm not trying to take away from any of that. But at the same time, there's just something really unsettling to me about the thought that Sean could have walked free if some guy hadn't been walking around his neighborhood at the exact right time, playing around with a new piece of tech he had just bought. To some degree, I think even Rob Leaf felt that way. According to reports, he ended up leaving the neighborhood shortly after all of this was over. In an interview, he explained that he needed a change. As usual, this is turning into a rant, so I'm going to cut things off here. But we're interested to hear what you all think. What bothers you the most about this case? And do you think we'll ever fully understand what happened? Regardless, our thoughts are definitely with the families and friends of Kathy Blair and Billy and Sydney Shelton. 3 lives that were tragically cut short in one of the most terrifying ways imaginable. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video.
Yay.
Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on the screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.
On a spring morning in 2010, a young man walked up to a 7-Eleven convenience store in Oklahoma City. Rather than going inside, he instead headed for one of the store's 3 payphones on the building's exterior, where he would make a brief call. Though this conversation lasted less than a minute, when it was over, the man was incredibly relieved. He had been in a pretty desperate situation, but now he had been assured that it was over, and as a result, all of his problems were going to be solved. The only thing he had to do now was sit tight for a bit. However, as hours passed that day and the man continued to stand around waiting with no further updates, it became increasingly clear that something was wrong. He desperately phoned back the number from that morning, but call after call went to voicemail. That's when it slowly dawned on him. Everything he had been promised was a lie. Late that afternoon, this man would make one final call from that bank of payphones. Shortly after he did, he was surrounded by police. If there's one thing that everyone agreed about 50-year-old Louis Fryer, it's that he was the kind of guy who went all in on the things that mattered to him in life. He could give you a dissertation on anything related to sports, especially University of Oklahoma football. He took pride in his ability to tell a story, and he could spend hours giving you the ins and outs of why he preferred modified float tubes over boats when it came to bass fishing. Yes, you could say that Louis was a man of many interests, but at the top of this list, there was always something that trumped everything else: being a dad. Louis's journey into fatherhood began in the early 1990s, after he met a woman named Trisha Wheeler. By all accounts, it was a real opposites attract situation. He was known for being more quiet and measured, while Trisha had a big personality and was very outgoing. Still, the couple quickly fell in love and got married. By 1994, they had welcomed 2 children to the world, a son named Keith and a daughter named Kaylee. They moved into a modest house in the city of Guthrie, located about 40 miles north of downtown Oklahoma City. For a while, the young family was incredibly happy. Louis had a good job working for a high-end picture framing business, where he was directly involved in designing the company's products. Trisha, meanwhile, was a stay-at-home mom for her 2 kids. Unfortunately, things wouldn't remain that way forever. While Louis continued to thrive both at home and at work, the same couldn't be said for Trisha. After developing a drug habit, she struggled with addiction, and soon ran into legal troubles as well. Because of drugs and weapons convictions, Trisha was in and out of prison for a lot of the early years of her kids' lives. Deciding he didn't want his children to be around all of that, Louis asked for a divorce. It was finalized in 1997, after which Louis got full custody of Keith and Kaylee. Though single fatherhood had its obvious challenges, Louis did his best to keep everyone happy and healthy. According to those that knew him, he put an immense amount of effort into making sure he was there for both of his kids regardless of his obligations at work. He made the most of every bit of time he had with them, whether that was during car rides to school every day or through sharing his love of football and fishing. By 2010, it appeared that all of this had been worth it. Keith was almost finished high school and Kaylee was halfway through. In a couple of years, it looked like Louis would be an empty nester. Maybe he'd spend his newfound time with his bass fishing club or on one of his other many neglected hobbies. Sadly, Louis would never get the chance to experience this next chapter of his life, or any other for that matter. You see, unbeknownst to him, at that very moment, he was at the center of a chilling plot, one with a disturbing hidden motive that he never could have imagined.
My dad's dead.
Wow.
Hey, where's this at?
My house. There's blood everywhere. I can't go in there.
What's your dad's name?
Louis Fryer. He didn't wake me up. In the morning, his car's gone. Everything's gone.
Is there blood? You said there's blood everywhere?
Yes, there's blood all over the floor. I tried to wake him up, and he didn't wake up.
I have him en route, okay?
Yes.
Gotta stay calm, okay?
I've never seen a dead body before.
The 911 call you just heard was placed at 7 o'clock in the morning on May 13th, 2010. It was made by Louis Fryer's 15-year-old daughter, Kaylee, who was completely frantic. Through tears, she explained that she had just stumbled across a horrifying scene in her father's bedroom. He was lying on the floor, unresponsive, and there was blood everywhere. She was worried that he might be dead. When officers from the Guthrie Police Department arrived at the scene, they found Kaylee hunched over and sobbing on the porch. She said that she was pretty sure her dad was the only other person inside, but since police didn't know what they were walking into, they entered the property with their weapons drawn and proceeded to do a detailed sweep of the house. It turned out that Kaylee was right. The only other person inside the residence was her dad, Louis Fryer. The 15-year-old's worst fears had also been correct. Tragically, the 50-year-old father was dead. Louis Fryer was found in the master bedroom, lying face down on the floor next to the left side of his bed. His body was tangled in the sheets and comforter of the bedding, which were covering most of him, with the exception of his upper back, head, and feet. The rest of the room was also in an obvious state of disarray. Based on Louis's injuries and the blood evidence, there was no question that he had been the victim of a brutal attack. His body was surrounded by a pool of blood on the carpet, and there was more of it in various places around the room. The most significant of this evidence was the blood on the exposed mattress of the bed, which suggested that Louis might have been attacked in his sleep. The actual cause of Louis's death was multiple stab wounds to his back and both sides of his neck. It would later be determined that the injuries to his neck in particular
would have been quickly fatal, which also explained the amount of blood at the scene. Injuries to the 50-year-old's hands heartbreakingly suggested that he had fought for his life. Based on the severity of the crime, Guthrie police contacted the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation for assistance with the case. At the same time, investigators turned their attention to the only potential witness they had so far, Kaylee Fryer. Because of how understandably distraught she was, after finding the 15-year-old at the crime scene, police had temporarily taken her to one of their cruisers to get her away from the house. Due to her age and the trauma she had just experienced, detectives tried to limit their questions, though they did ask her if she could tell them anything she could remember about the lead-up to the crime. Kaylee said that as far as she was aware, she really hadn't seen or heard much. The previous night, she and her dad had watched a movie together, and afterwards, they had both gone to bed at around 10:30 p.m. From that point on, Kaylee said she'd been fast asleep. In fact, when she woke up on her own just before 7 a.m. that morning, it was the first sign that something was wrong. Her dad usually woke her up for school, but that morning the house was eerily quiet. When she had gone looking for him, she had encountered the disturbing crime scene and called 911. When asked if she knew any reason why someone might want to hurt her father, Kaylee said no. The only thing she could think of was that maybe it had been a robbery. As she had mentioned during the 911 call, her dad's white Buick Century was missing from its usual spot on the driveway. This information piqued the interest of detectives, whose first inclination had also been that the crime could have been a robbery gone wrong, especially after they discovered that Louis Fryer's wallet and a cup full of change that he usually kept next to his bed were missing. They theorized that perhaps the perpetrator had broken in and had been in the process of stealing several of the 50-year-old's valuables when he woke up. A struggle ensued, during which Louis was killed. A search of the rest of the house initially didn't seem to support or disprove this theory one way or the other. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere at the residence, though one window was found slightly open and could have conceivably been used to get inside. The only thing investigators were confident of was that the killer had escaped out the back door after the murder. This was because of blood smears which were found exclusively on the inside of the back door. However, detectives' thoughts about the case started to shift when they made another discovery in the kitchen. A single knife was missing from a butcher block that was sitting on the counter. To them, this seemed inconsistent with a robbery gone wrong. It now looked like whoever had done this had deliberately armed themselves before heading into Louis' bedroom. Perhaps their intent had been to kill him all along. If that were the case, though, the question became, who would have done something like this? And what was their motive? Investigators thought they might have their answer when they learned that Louis had a second child, one who was suspiciously absent from the house that morning. About 2 hours into the school day on May 13th, 2010, there was a knock at the door of a classroom at Guthrie High School. When the teacher opened up, they were greeted by a group of police officers who stated that they needed to speak with 18-year-old Keith Fryer immediately. The senior went with the officers as requested and was walked to the school's main office. Unbeknownst to him, it wasn't his principal waiting there. It was agents from the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation. And they had quite a few questions.
Don't tell me I don't.
You see, back at the crime scene, detectives had received one more potentially useful piece of information from Kaylee. She told them that just 3 days before the murder, her dad had kicked her brother Keith out of the house. Upon being informed of the awful tragedy that had taken place, Keith instantly became emotional. He threw a chair, yelled, and briefly stormed out of the office, accusing the OSBI agents of lying to him. However, he eventually calmed down enough to the point where authorities were able to ask him some questions. First and foremost, what had happened 3 days earlier between him and his father? Keith stated that the whole thing had been about a fight at school, something that he had had problems with in the past. This time, though, the consequences were more severe. His dad had a rule. If he got into trouble for fighting once he turned 18, he would have to find another place to live.
And that's exactly what had happened. For the past couple of days, Keith had been staying with friends. While the 18-year-old admitted that tempers flared at the time, he claimed he hadn't been holding a grudge against his father, certainly not the kind that would have led him to do something like this. In fact, Keith said that being kicked out was more of a tough love thing than any sort of serious feud between them. He knew this because literally the day that he left the house, his dad apparently checked up on him through one of his best friends. Louis had lunch with the friend, during which he apparently admitted he was going to let Keith come home as soon as he showed that he had smartened up. Tragically, Keith said he and his dad were on the verge of patching things up, but now they would never get that chance. Police weren't simply going to take Keith at his word, so they asked him if he could provide them with an alibi for the previous 24 hours. He gave them the information of some friends who he said could vouch for his whereabouts specifically during the time frame when the murder took place. Authorities immediately followed up on this, and it seemed that Keith's alibi checked out. With Keith now looking more like a tragic victim of circumstance rather than a serious suspect, investigators began asking him similar questions to the ones that they had asked his sister. Was there anyone that he could think of that might want to hurt his dad? Or was there any other motive behind the crime that they might be missing? Much like Kaylee, the 18-year-old said that there wasn't really anything like that he was aware of. As far as he knew, his father didn't have any enemies. However, Keith did tip authorities off to something potentially interesting. He mentioned his parents' divorce, as well as the fact that his mother Tricia had been in and out of prison over the years. By this point, detectives had already been trying to reach Tricia Wheeler, especially because she was now the legal guardian of her 15-year-old daughter, and they needed her present before they could ask Kaylee any more questions. However, the revelation about Tricia's criminal history added a new potential vector to the case. Could she have somehow been involved? Though multiple calls to Tricia initially went unanswered, she eventually showed up at the police station in Guthrie on her own out of the blue. She said that her phone had been dead, but that luckily she had only been about an hour's drive away in Oklahoma City. She stated that she came right over as soon as she heard about what had happened. After agreeing to undergo questioning, Tricia denied any involvement in what had happened. She said that yes, her and Louis had gone through a divorce, but that was more than a decade ago at this point. She stated that she never would have hurt the father of her children, nor did she have any reason to. Detectives asked Tricia about the custody situation between her and Louis, probing to see if this was a potential motive. However, she claimed that if anything, her ex-husband was more generous with her than he needed to be. Despite being granted full custody, Louis let Tricia see the kids far more than what was legally ordered, especially as they had gotten older. A lot of times, Keith and Kaylee would spend the weekends with her. It wasn't every weekend, but it was enough that she was a constant presence in their lives. Detectives weren't sure what to think, but Tricia provided an alibi, which they began looking into. In the meantime, they were able to ask Kaylee some more questions now that her mom could sit in with her. Investigators asked Kaylee if she could provide them with the names of any other people who might have had access to her family's house. Was there anyone else that had a key, or someone who might have been a frequent visitor? She told police that no one like that came to mind. Her dad didn't normally like to have people over at the house. The interview went on like this for a while, though unfortunately, it didn't appear that Kaylee had much more that she could provide. Investigators were further stumped when they received confirmation that Tricia Wheeler's alibi had checked out as well. It looked like they were back to square one. Luckily for investigators, the situation wouldn't stay that way for long. As it turned out, one small tip was about to snowball into a series of startling revelations. Around the same time the detectives were hitting a dead end in their questioning of Tricia Wheeler down at the local police station, OSBI agents and other investigators from the Guthrie PD were looking for any new leads they could find back at the crime scene. In particular, they had started canvassing the area, speaking with neighbors and others that knew the family, and asking if they had seen anything suspicious around the time of Louis Fryer's murder. At first, this process was fairly frustrating. It appeared that no one had seen anything out of the ordinary the previous night. However, the tactic would pay off when investigators received some very interesting insights about the Fryer home. The information came from two friends of the person who up until now had been the star witness in the case, 15-year-old Kaylee. It turned out that Kaylee had been rather selective about the information that she had given to police. For example, though she brought up her brother Keith's problems with their dad about fighting, she failed to mention that she had actually gotten in trouble for the exact same thing. If anything, her situation was worse. She had been kicked out of the same school 3 times for fighting. In fact, it had been a while since the 15-year-old had been to school at all. According to Kaylee's friends, for the last little while, her dad had been trying to rein in her reckless behavior by becoming increasingly strict about her social life. This had backfired, though, as Kaylee had not only despised this, she had gotten around his rules by simply going behind his back. She was drinking, using drugs, and having people over at the house without Louis's knowledge. All of it happened while he was at work. Since Kaylee wasn't in school, she was at home doing whatever she wanted during the day. By far, the biggest secret that Kaylee was keeping from her dad, though, was about the relationship she was in. For the last several months, she had been dating a 21-year-old man named Jerry J. Childs. The friends told police that Kaylee was well aware that her dad never would have approved of a relationship. Jay didn't exactly have a lot going for him. He didn't have a job, he wasn't in school, and he was also basically homeless after having been kicked out of his own house, as well as another place where he had been staying with friends. Of course, all of this was sort of beside the point, because there was a much more obvious issue: the 6-year age gap between Jay and Kaylee. I should also point out that the age of consent in Oklahoma is 16, so technically, the relationship wasn't even legal. Despite all of this, Kaylee's friends explained that she had been sneaking Jay in and out of her house for some time. They also told investigators one more thing. 3 days ago, Louis had found out about what was going on. It was actually Keith who had spilled the beans when he was getting kicked out. The friends didn't know all the details, but they were pretty sure that Louis had confronted Jay in their neighborhood shortly after learning about all of this. He told him that he was too old for Kaylee and that he didn't want him seeing her anymore. Understandably, these were bombshell revelations, ones that detectives realized could very well be related to Louis's murder. With that, they began searching for Jay Childs and released an all-points bulletin as a part of an effort to track him down. No sooner had this APB been released than authorities received another update about the case. Louis's missing Buick Century had been found on a dead-end street in the community of Valleybrook, about 40 miles south of the crime scene. Officers rushed to the area and were able to secure the vehicle, which was taken in for processing. Understandably, there were high hopes that it might offer crucial insights into the murder, especially since it had almost certainly been driven by the perpetrator. Unfortunately, this would not be the case. Aside from the car keys, which were found in the center console, there was little of note inside, and none of the items taken from the Fryer home were recovered. This isn't to say that the vehicle was a complete letdown, though. In fact, it was about to become a major piece of circumstantial evidence. Late in the afternoon on May 13th, 2010, Guthrie police received a call from a young woman named Sarah Kester. She said that she had information concerning the whereabouts of her friend, Jay Childs. Jay had just called her crying and begging for a ride, saying that he was stranded in Oklahoma City. Specifically, he was at the Crossroads Mall, less than a mile away from the place where Louis Fryer's abandoned Buick had been found. Minutes later, at around 5 p.m., Jay was surrounded by police in the parking lot of the mall and agreed to come in for questioning. After sitting down in an interview room, detectives confronted Jay about what they knew so far. He vehemently denied having anything to do with Louis's murder and said that his proximity to the car was a complete coincidence. He claimed that the real reason he had been stranded was that he had been hanging out with friends and that they had kicked him out of their vehicle. Understandably, investigators had a hard time believing this and began pressing Jay for further details. When they did, he quickly changed his story. Jay now admitted that he had been secretly staying at the Fryer house for the past few nights. Kaylee had been letting him in after her dad went to sleep, and he had been sneaking out before Louis woke up. He claimed that it was all going fine until they had been caught. Jay stated that just like usual, Kaylee had let him in the previous evening, and they had made their way to her bedroom. They must have made too much noise or something, he said, because not long after, they heard footsteps coming down the hallway. Seconds later, he said Louis had burst inside, and after realizing what was going on, had flown into a rage. Jay said that he ran for it, but before he could make it out of the house, Louis had cornered him with a golf club in the kitchen. That's when he had grabbed a knife from the butcher's block and fought back. He didn't want to hurt Louis, he said. It was self-defense. Immediately, detectives knew that this story couldn't be true. For starters, the blood evidence didn't show any sign of a struggle anywhere other than Louis' bedroom. On top of this, the only golf clubs in the house were in Louis' bedroom closet, the same closet that Louis' feet were blocking where he had fallen after being stabbed to death. There was just no way he could have used one of these clubs during the struggle. When pressed on these inconsistencies, Jay changed his story again. He now admitted that he had gone into the Fryer house that night with the intention of robbing Louis. However, he still claimed that the killing had been an accident. While grabbing valuables from the 50-year-old's bedroom, Jay said he woke up. He said he stabbed Louis to death in a panic. While detectives felt that Jay was getting closer to telling them what had really happened, there was still one thing that didn't make sense. If the point was just to rob Louis, why had Jay grabbed a knife from the kitchen before going into his bedroom?
He wanted to kill him, obviously.
Seemingly having no clear answer for this, and realizing that he wasn't going to be able to lie his way out of the situation, Jay finally conceded. He said that he was ready to tell the truth. What he told investigators next was nothing short of horrifying. Jay explained that for the last several weeks, Kaylee had been trying to convince him to murder her father. She told him that she couldn't live under his rules anymore, and she was sick of him trying to control her life. She wanted to live with her mom, who she said would let her do what she wanted. At first, Jay said he told Kaylee there was no way he was going to do that, especially since when he asked for specifics about why her home life was so unbearable, all she could come up with was that her dad was mean and that he forced her to do laundry and chores.
Oh, no.
However, Jay said the situation changed a couple of days ago when Kaylee gave him some completely unexpected news. She told him that she was pregnant. She also said that there was no way her dad was ever going to let them be together or keep the baby. If they wanted to be a family, their only hope was moving in with her mom, and the only way that was going to happen was if Louis was out of the picture. With everything laid out like this, Jay said he finally relented, and when Keith got kicked out of the house temporarily, he explained that Kaylee saw a perfect opportunity to carry out their plan without having to worry about potential witnesses. At around 3 a.m. that morning, Jay stated that he snuck in through the back door of the Fryer home, which Kaylee had left unlocked for him. He then grabbed a kitchen knife from the butcher block where she had shown him and headed down the hall towards Louis' room. Jay explained that even after making his way inside, he almost didn't go through with the murder. At one point, he actually turned around and started walking away, but he eventually convinced himself to go back. He stood at the foot of Louis' bed, knife in hand, trying to work up the nerve. In the end, it was panic that had motivated him to act. He saw Louis' arm move, and thinking he was awake, Jay said he just started swinging the blade. He stated that he and Louis had struggled, but the surprise of the attack had given him the edge. Louis was too badly hurt to fight back and had fallen over onto the floor. His last words were, "Help me." After Louis was dead, Jay said that he grabbed his wallet, car keys, and the cup of change from his bedside table
and ran out the back door, leaving behind the bloodstains. He took Louis's car from the driveway and started heading towards Oklahoma City, throwing the murder weapon and the 50-year-old's wallet out the window on the way. He dumped the vehicle in Valley Brook, where it had later been found. Just before 7 a.m., Jay said that he had walked over to a 7-Eleven convenience store near the Crossroads Mall. He called Kaylee from a payphone, telling her that he had gotten rid of all the evidence. 1 minute later, Kaylee had called 911 pretending she had just stumbled across the crime scene. Jay said that for the next few hours after that, he had waited for Kaylee and her mom to come and pick him up. He thought that they were going to start their new life together, but they never came. Needless to say, detectives were stunned by Jay's confession. He was arrested immediately afterwards. Kaylee was taken into custody a short time later. Both of them were charged with first-degree murder. Understandably, no one wanted to believe that Kaylee could be responsible for such a heinous crime, particularly those closest to her. Investigators were having similar reservations. Given how much he had lied, could they really believe what Jay Childs was telling them? As they continued to unearth new evidence, though, it increasingly began to back up what the 21-year-old had claimed. For starters, there were Kaylee's phone records, which not only verified the timeline exactly as Jay had laid it out, but contradicted the 15-year-old's original version of events. Despite what she had told police about sleeping through the night, the records showed that Kaylee had checked her voicemail and accessed the internet around 3:30 a.m., right after the murder had taken place. Next, there was the additional forensic examination on Louis's body, which suggested that it had been moved at least slightly after his death. The only person who would have been in the house at that point was Kaylee. Again, she had originally claimed she never went all the way into her father's bedroom. Perhaps the most damning evidence suggesting Kaylee was the mastermind, though, came from her MySpace page as well as a journal found in her bedroom. In both places, investigators found disturbing writings that expressed how much she hated her father. Her MySpace profile read in part, quote, "The story of my life is complicated. My mom, she's the most important thing in my life. If anyone knows me real well, they'd know that I'd do anything for her. My dad, on the other hand, I could care less what happens to him. He means nothing to me." As chilling as all of this already was, there was one final nail in the coffin, so to speak, that would arguably prove to be the most consequential of all. After being taken into custody, authorities would get access to recorded phone conversations of Kaylee while in jail. In conversations with her mother, she reportedly made it clear that she had never actually been pregnant. Also, that she had never intended for Jay to actually come and live with them. After being informed that he had been completely manipulated into doing what Kaylee wanted, Jay agreed to plead guilty to first-degree murder as well as testify against her. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to request that he receive life with parole rather than life without parole during sentencing. Nearly 1 year to the day after Louis Fryer's murder, his daughter went on trial for the killing. Due to the severity of the crime, she was tried as an adult. During the proceedings, Kaylee's defense did their best to highlight the age gap between her and Jay, suggesting that it was therefore obvious who was really responsible for what had happened. They portrayed her as an innocent teen who had gotten caught up in the schemes of an older man. Their theory of the case was that Jay was actually the one who wanted Louis dead. The reason, they argued, was that when he found out Kaylee might be pregnant, he feared that he would go to prison due to the fact that she was underage. Interestingly, they pointed to the fact that this wasn't the first time Jay had gotten involved with a younger girl. 3 years earlier, he had actually married a 16-year-old, though in that case he was also only 18, so the age gap wasn't nearly as consequential. Still, they pointed out that about 6 months after the marriage, the teen had gone on to file a protective order against Jay. Ultimately, though, the jury was more convinced by the prosecution's story, especially when they presented their evidence along with Jay's testimony. When it was all over, Kaylee Fryer was found guilty of first-degree murder. She was also sentenced to life with parole, a life sentence
is considered to be 45 years in Oklahoma, and first-degree murder is an 85% crime. So with that in mind, it means that the earliest that Jay and Kaylee will be eligible for parole is sometime in the late 2040s. Perhaps unsurprisingly, a lot of the stuff that we came across while researching this story focused on who was more responsible for Louis Fryer's murder, Kaylee or Jay. I think you could make a convincing case for either one, and I'm interested to hear all of your thoughts in the comments below. But I ultimately think it's sort of beside the point. Louis Fryer was a beloved father, son, friend, and so much more. And at the end of the day, his life was stolen from him over basically nothing. What I find particularly haunting is the thought that in his final moments, when he was calling out for help in the dark, he had no idea that one of the two people he loved most in the world was responsible for what was happening to him. While I think that Kaylee and Jay both deserve to be where they are right now, at the same time, I think it's worth pointing out that there's a second layer of tragedy to this whole situation. And that's that two young people also threw their lives away in the process of committing this heinous crime. All that being said, I think it's important to try and find some semblance of redemption in these stories wherever possible. And in this case, I think that's in the undeniable love that Louis showed for both of his children. As Keith said in an interview that we came across, he thinks that his dad would have forgiven Kaylee despite what she did. And ultimately, that's how he wants him to be remembered. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care. When you were a kid, did you ever have like a secret place that only you and a few other people knew about?
Yeah,
Maybe it was your favorite spot in the woods, or a hideout that you and your friends made, or even a local abandoned building that most people were too afraid to go inside. Well, today's story features one of these kinds of places. One that in the summer of 2011 would turn out to be of extraordinary significance to a group of investigators in Missouri. At the time, police were investigating a mysterious double disappearance case, and they were in desperate need of a lead that would help to move the case forward. Though detectives were frustrated, that would change as soon as they learned about this location. What they would find there would be incredibly disturbing, but it would also start to explain everything else that they had encountered up until that point.
This is Solis Bay.
911, where's your emergency?
Yes, I'm trying to get a hold of my mother. The lights are on in the house. The door's open. I have knocked. I have called. I mean, I'm really worried about her, and I'm scared to go in the house by myself.
The 911 call you just heard was placed a few minutes before midnight on April 18th, 2011. It was made by a 26-year-old woman named Jessica Bullock, who had contacted authorities in Greene County, Missouri, after she was unable to reach her mother, 46-year-old Rebecca Becky Porter. Jessica told dispatchers that she hadn't heard from her mom in over 24 hours. This was extremely unusual because the two of them talked pretty much every day, often multiple times. At first, Jessica said she was worried because she knew her mother hadn't been feeling well the last couple of days. In fact, she had been trying to convince her to go to the hospital, but Becky had been putting it off. The last time they spoke, April 17th, Becky said that she would see how she felt in the morning. It was a Sunday night, and she didn't want to miss work the next day. When the morning came and went without any word from her mom, Jessica tried calling but received no answer. She started phoning other family members to see if they had heard anything, but none of them were able to get a hold of Becky either. By the time the night of April 18th had rolled around, Jessica was concerned enough that she decided to try and physically check up on her mom. She hopped in her car and made the 45-minute drive to her home, which was located in a rural part of Greene County just outside the city of Willard. Becky lived in an old farmhouse there with her new husband, 34-year-old Russell, who everyone called Rusty. Now, Jessica had only been to the farmhouse a few times, but very quickly after arriving that night, she got an intense feeling that something wasn't right. Despite the late hour, one of the main doors of the property was wide open, as if someone had momentarily stepped outside. Jessica walked up to the door and called out for her mother several times. There was no response from within, even though the lights were on and she could see Becky's car on the driveway. It was the only vehicle that she and Rusty owned. Thoroughly freaked out by the situation and unable to work up the nerve to explore further, Jessica called 911. When officers from the Greene County Sheriff's Department arrived at the farmhouse, they quickly cleared it, confirming that there were no intruders. This wasn't exactly comforting, as no one else was inside the home either. In fact, the only thing waiting for authorities was a bunch more disturbing details. Things began as soon as the officers stepped inside, and they were hit by the powerful and unmistakable odor of bleach. The smell was particularly strong in the kitchen, where it appeared that puddles of it had been splashed on the floor. However, the only bottle under the sink was completely full. In a room that looked like it was being used as an office, police found more signs of strange activity. A mess of tangled wires had been haphazardly scattered around. They were underneath a monitor that was no longer connected to a computer, and which seemed to have been hastily tossed onto the carpet. Similarly concerning discoveries were soon made in the master bedroom. The place was in a complete state of disarray, with pillows, blankets, and other items thrown onto the floor. Among these were Becky's cell phone and her purse. The mattress of the bed was also slightly askew on the box spring, as if someone had gotten up in a hurry. As hours went by that morning and the sun came up, two final clues would be revealed. Together, they were arguably the most disturbing pieces of evidence that authorities had encountered so far. The reason? They were the most alarming signs yet that the Porters had not been alone at the time of their disappearances. As word spread that Rusty and Becky Porter were missing, everyone initially wanted to believe that there was an innocent and reasonable explanation for their absences. However, the more time that passed, the harder it became to believe that they had simply gone somewhere of their own accord, especially as investigators continued to find things at their house that seemed to contradict this. In addition to Becky's cell phone and purse, which contained her cash, credit cards, and ID, detectives found prescription drugs belonging to Rusty on his bedside table. These were pills and medications that he was supposed to take daily following a cancer treatment. And it wasn't something that he would have left behind if he was planning on being away from the house for more than a few hours. There was also the question of how the couple could have even left the house in the first place. As previously mentioned, Becky's Ford Mustang was still in the driveway, and the keys were actually found in the ignition. Even Rusty and Becky's shoes were still inside their home. Detectives' first theory was that maybe the Porters had been the victims of some kind of late-night robbery gone wrong. However, the evidence didn't seem to line up with this idea either. It turned out that Rusty and Becky's cash and vehicle weren't the only valuables left behind. Their big screen TV, a computer, and many other items also hadn't been touched. That brings us to the two discoveries I mentioned that police made when the sun came up. The first was a bunch of security cameras that were found damaged and lying all over the yard outside. The cameras looked like they had originally been pointed to record various areas of the exterior of the farmhouse, but that someone had gone around and systematically smashed them all. Some of the cables that were attached to these cameras went through the walls of the home, and interestingly, led to that office room that had been found in a state of disarray.
When police went back to the room, they realized that the cameras and that monitor on the floor had been connected to a computer that was no longer there. This was incredibly noteworthy, since other than the porters themselves, this was one of the only items in the house that detectives could say for sure was missing. Obviously, someone didn't want authorities to see the footage that these cameras had recorded. The second discovery was equally as important and unnerving. In the kitchen, detectives had previously noticed that one of the windows was open. However, it wasn't until they saw something flapping in the morning breeze that they realized that the screen on this window had actually been cut. Taking this in combination with the puddles of bleach they found earlier, police came to a startling conclusion. Someone had likely used this window to get into the porter's house. The bleach might have been used in an attempt to destroy fingerprints and DNA evidence. Following these two discoveries, police were convinced that they were dealing with a serious crime. The question was, who would want to harm Rusty and Becky? For answers, police turned to the people that knew the porters best, their friends and family. They started with Rusty's mother, Kay, who lived in a small home located just behind the main farmhouse. Kay told investigators that the last time she heard from her son was on the night of April 17th, the same evening that Jessica had also last spoken to Becky. Rusty had swung by his mom's place for a short visit, as well as to pick up some ibuprofen, since Becky wasn't feeling well. Kay said that there wasn't anything out of the ordinary about their conversation, and that Rusty was acting completely normal. Unfortunately, she hadn't heard anything else that evening that might be able to help detectives, though she was able to narrow the timeline a little further. When she woke up the next morning, Kay said Becky's car was still in the driveway, which she thought was unusual. Normally, Becky left pretty early in the morning for work, getting in her car no later than 7:30. At the time, Kay told herself that maybe Becky stayed home from work because she was sick. Now, however, she was pretty sure that her son and his wife were already gone by the morning of the 18th. The only other neighbor of the porters within reasonable walking distance was Kay's brother, Robert Campbell. Robert also lived on the 120-acre farm property, which had originally been owned by he and Kay's parents. However, police would have to wait to speak with Robert. He was a long-haul trucker and at the time had been on his way to Texas with his wife Carolyn. In the meantime, detectives asked the family about Rusty and Becky's relationship. Were there any problems that they knew about? Was there anyone with a grudge against them? For Kay, one person immediately came to mind: Becky's ex-husband. Before she met Rusty, Becky had been married for 26 years to a church pastor. Those who were close to her said that the divorce between them had been ugly. Specifically, there had been a long and drawn-out legal battle over who would get to keep a restaurant that they owned together. Detectives interviewed Becky's ex-husband, but it quickly became clear that he had nothing to do with her or Rusty's disappearances. He had a solid alibi covering the time when the couple went missing, and he also seemed genuinely devastated to hear that something might have happened to Becky. With the ex-husband ruled out, authorities began to probe a little deeper into Rusty and Becky's personal lives. It wasn't long before they found something that they thought might be of interest. Inside the couple's home, detectives found letters written by Becky to Rusty. In them, Becky was expressing a lot of frustration, saying that she was fed up with the way things were going. When police asked her daughter, Jessica, about this, she said that recently her mother had confided in her that she and Rusty had been arguing a lot. Though Rusty and Becky had been married for a little under a year at the time they went missing, not everyone had been convinced that they should be together. According to one source we came across, some people were put off by the 12-year age gap between them, and Jessica and her brother hadn't attended the wedding. However, Rusty's family had a very different interpretation of the relationship. They said that they had never seen Rusty happier than when he was with Becky, and that she had pulled him out of a really dark place. As a side note here, I should mention that a lot of the sources we came across in our research stated that Rusty had struggled with drugs and alcohol before meeting Becky, though unfortunately,
I know
pretty much all of these sources were vague when it came to
and
details
still
about his
struggling.
life.
Very hard to be high.
The
all
most
the fucking time,
comprehensive
especially if
account
you
we
work.
could find was in an online obituary,
What's
which
it?
noted that Rusty suffered some injuries in the mid-2000s while working as a mechanic in professional
going on?
car racing. It seems that these injuries ended his career, so it's possible that this is when he started to struggle with addiction. Take that with a grain of salt, though, as we're just kind of reading between the lines here and weren't actually able to confirm this. Anyway, what does seem to be true is that when Becky came into Rusty's life, things got a whole lot better. Pretty much every statement given by one of his family members mentions at some point that he seemed extremely in love with Becky and that she was the reason he turned his life around. Now you might be saying to yourself,
very bad.
if Rusty and Becky were so happy then, what was the deal with those letters that police found?
They weren't.
Well, according to
never
Rusty's
just
siblings,
briefly.
the tension between the couple wasn't necessarily about their relationship. It was about an ongoing situation that they were having with
No way.
another member of the family. And that family member was Rusty's uncle and neighbor, Robert Campbell. Apparently, it was well known that Rusty and Robert didn't get along. Robert was very territorial when it came to the family's 120-acre property, and he wasn't happy when Kay let Rusty and Becky move into the old farmhouse. Several days into the investigation, detectives were finally able to sit down with Robert after he had returned from his trucking route down in Texas. By this time, they had learned a couple more interesting things that they wanted to speak with him about. It turned out that in the weeks leading up to the disappearances, Rusty and Robert had each tried to obtain orders of protection against each other multiple times. In one of these court filings, Rusty said that his uncle had gone as far as to drive past their house and yell that he should watch himself because he wasn't going to be around much longer. When asked about all of this, Robert admitted that things had gotten heated between him and his nephew, claiming that the threats had been exchanged on both sides. However, he said these were empty words. If anything, he said he had more of a reason to be afraid of Rusty, since he was just an old man with health problems. He vehemently denied having anything to do with the disappearances, saying that he never would have done anything to hurt his nephew or his new wife.
Can you tell me, look me in the eye and tell me you didn't have anything to do with this?
I did not have anything to do.
It's your sister's boy. This is flesh and blood.
You're a good cop, but you're barking up the wrong tree.
Obviously, investigators weren't just going to take Robert at his word, so they looked into his alibi to see if they could corroborate it. Everything they found lined up with him being on a long-haul trucking route to Texas, including detailed cell phone data that showed both him and his wife going on the journey. At this point, things were looking pretty bad for detectives. They had a lot of details pointing to the Porters' disappearances being suspicious, but there was almost no hard evidence indicating what had actually happened to them. On top of this, they had no clear suspects and no real motives. Over the next few weeks, searches continued on the 120-acre farm property. However, these too came up short. In the meantime, Rusty and Becky's friends and families did whatever they could to try and keep the case alive. They printed and handed out thousands of flyers, making sure they were in every convenience store, restaurant, truck stop, and gas station possible. They also gave countless interviews with local media, hoping to garner new leads and maintain public interest in the investigation. More than anything, though, they prayed that they would return home safely. This grueling state of uncertainty would last approximately 3 months until finally detectives received a phone call out of the blue. Unfortunately, it wasn't the sort of call that anyone had hoped for. In July of 2011, investigators with the Greene County Sheriff's Department were notified about a potential lead in the Rusty and Becky Porter case. It had come from an inmate at the local county jail who said that they had information that might be of interest. The details were nothing short of chilling. The inmate told authorities that one night shortly before he was arrested, he had been hanging out at a bar when he was approached by a man named Tony Friend. The pair struck up a conversation, during which Tony began to brag about a bunch of crimes he said he had committed. Among them, he claimed, were the murders of a local couple, Rusty and Becky Porter. Well, technically, Tony didn't say that he killed them exactly. He opted for a more coded phrase. He said that he had taken away their birthdays. While detectives maintained a healthy skepticism of the inmate's story, considering it was a jailhouse confession, as they started looking further into Tony Friend, they were disturbed by what they found. The 43-year-old had a lengthy rap sheet that included multiple violent crimes and weapons-related offenses. In short, he definitely seemed capable of committing such a crime. It was when authorities obtained Tony's cell phone records, though, that they really felt like they might be onto something. The data placed him right in the vicinity of Rusty and Becky's house on the night of April 17th, right around the time police believed the couple had gone missing. Investigators brought Tony in for questioning, but it quickly became clear that it would not be a productive interview. The 43-year-old claimed that he had never met the Porters and had nothing to do with their disappearances. He refused to respond to many questions, and even when he did speak, he was careful to remain evasive with his answers. In fact, he wouldn't even confirm that he had grown up in the community of Cedar Creek, Missouri. This last part in particular stuck out as incredibly odd to detectives. What purpose could Tony have for trying to conceal his hometown? When they took another look at his cell phone records, they thought they might know why. But first, they decided to speak with some of Tony Friend's relatives. While questioning Tony's family, investigators asked if there were any places that he used to frequent, anywhere that he might go to get away or otherwise escape from everyday life. One such location came up a number of times. A cousin of Tony's referred to it as the Bulldozer Place. The cousin told detectives that the Bulldozer Place was a spot where she, Tony, and a bunch of their other family members used to play when they were kids. It was in a dense, wooded area in Taney County near Cedar Creek, one that was difficult to get to by vehicle. You could drive as far as a large open field right before the location, but you had to travel the rest of the way on foot. The cousin said that the family had called it the Bulldozer Place because of the old disabled bulldozer that had been dumped there. Next to that were some extremely dilapidated cabins that had long since been abandoned. There was one cabin in particular where she said she knew Tony used to hang out a lot. You could tell which one it was because there was also a large boat lying nearby. This was exactly the kind of information detectives were hoping for. You see, when they had taken that second look at Tony's cell phone records, they noticed that after leaving the area around the Porter's house on April 17th, he had traveled about 80 miles south. They knew that he had been somewhere around Cedar Creek, but they weren't quite sure where. Now, police finally had a specific place to look. On July 21st, investigators headed out to the Bulldozer Place, along with their counterparts from the Taney County Sheriff's Office. They went to that specific broken-down cabin that Tony's cousin had mentioned, and disturbingly, as soon as they got within a few yards of it, they could smell the unmistakably foul odor of decomposition. In the center of the cabin, there was a large pile of debris, and when detectives cleared it, they revealed a hole in the wooden floor. Inside were the bodies of two people. They were still dressed in what appeared to be pajamas, and an autopsy revealed that each of them had died from a single contact gunshot wound to the right temple. Because of the level of decomposition, investigators needed to use DNA and dental records to make a positive identification. But soon, everyone's worst fears were confirmed. These were the bodies of Rusty and Becky Porter. More blood evidence at the scene showed that they had been killed at the location where their remains were discovered. For the couple's families, the news was understandably devastating. Of course, they had been aware that something like this could be coming, but to have it be confirmed was still an incredibly difficult thing to process, especially since there was still no indication as to why any of this had happened in the first place. Investigators also weren't exactly sure what to make of the situation. However, they did have one more thing left to try that might help them to find the answers that they were looking for. Though discovering Rusty and Becky Porter dead wasn't the result that anyone had hoped for, detectives with the Greene County Sheriff's Department were now determined to switch their focus to finding the couple's killer and getting justice. That being said, there was an obvious issue that they were going to have to overcome first. Right now, all signs pointed to their main suspect, Tony Friend, as being the culprit. However, authorities knew that even with this major break in the case, the likelihood of obtaining a confession from him was pretty much zero. Tony was a hardened criminal, and their last interview with him had demonstrated that he wasn't going to crack under the pressure of an interrogation.
Not so heavy.
For investigators, there was someone else who just might. You see, when police had taken that second deep dive into the cell phone records, they hadn't just limited their search to Tony. They were also looking at people he had been in contact with, including a number of his family members. And according to the data, there were 3 people who had followed an almost identical path to Tony on the night of April 17th. His wife, Wendy Friend, his nephew, Dusty Hicks, and his son, Philip Friend. Philip was only 26 years old, and detectives felt that he was the one with the most to lose. After kind of feeling him out in an initial interview where he denied any involvement, they decided to move ahead with murder charges against him. Almost immediately afterwards, Philip said that he was ready to talk. Philip said that a few days before the crime, his dad had come to him about a job. He said it paid $100,000 in exchange for taking 2 birthdays.
My dad came to me a week before her disappearance, told me he had this job. It was $100,000 for 2 birthdays.
Yeah, and what does taking birthdays mean to you?
That means killing them.
On the night of April 17th, Philip said his dad, Wendy, and Dusty got into their truck and drove to the Porter's property. Wendy waited in the vehicle while the rest of them put on ski masks and gloves and started creeping up towards the farmhouse. Initially, they had struggled to find a way inside, but after a while, Dusty noticed that the kitchen window had been left slightly open. They pulled it the rest of the way, cut the screen, and then Tony and Philip lifted him so he could climb through. Once inside, he opened the back door so that they could get in as well. The 3 of them then walked to the master bedroom, where they ambushed Rusty and Becky in their sleep.
My dad helped him get into the kitchen.
Damn, what a...
He unlocked the back door.
Way to die, what the fuck. Random fucks.
My dad walked in, I walked in. My dad flipped on the light to their bedroom. They jumped out of bed. My dad and Dusty were holding guns out. We were scared. I said, shut up or I'll shoot you.
While holding the couple at gunpoint, Philip said that they destroyed the security cameras and stole the computer it was recording to so that there wouldn't be any footage to find. They splashed bleach all over the kitchen in an attempt to cover any forensic evidence that they might have left behind. Prior to breaking in, they had also duct taped around the wrists and ankles of their clothing to prevent any stray hair fibers from falling. Once all of this was done, Philip explained that they had marched Rusty and Becky out to the truck. Their hands were zip-tied, and they were forced to get inside. Philip said that they were completely terrified, and that they were begging for their lives and kept pleading to know who they were and what was going on.
What'd they say?
Why are you doing this? Who are you? Please don't kill us.
Piece of shit, I'm a piece of shit, that's why I'm there.
Philip said that they drove Wendy home, then continued on to a rural and wooded area in Taney County. The detectives now knew it was the bulldozer place.
What the fuck?
After parking in the field right before the forest, Tony got out and told Philip and Dusty to wait. He then forced Rusty and Becky out as well, with a gun to their backs, and with nothing on but their pajamas. Tony had forced the couple to walk off barefoot into the darkness. Philip said that he and Dusty sat there for about 10 minutes before they heard what was unmistakably a gunshot. Another 10 minutes passed, at which point they heard a second shot. Philip said that it wasn't until he saw his dad return from the woods alone that the magnitude of what they had just done truly started to sink in. Of course, as you may have noticed, there was one piece of the puzzle noticeably absent from Philip's story. Who had offered them the $100,000 to kill the Porters in the first place. Philip said that was easy.
On my kids, not on yours.
It was Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell, Robert's wife,
Bă, dar nu este
Carolyn.
wooden planks, frate, pe 3 hărți, doamne fute-l azi. Abandoned house, zi-mi și mie ce ai, medium planks, pot să iau medium planks să le fac wooden planks normale?
It turned out that Robert Campbell had been behind the plot to kill the Porters all along.
Dar mi-e prea
While
foame să o
authorities
mai
already
gândesc
knew
și
that he
atunci
had
ne
been
oprim aici.
angry about the farmhouse in